You do not discover the truth simply because someone tells you. You discover it because actions eventually reveal what words try to hide. A man may control what he says, but he cannot fully control his habits or repeated behaviors. And when he has recently shared his attention or emotions with someone else, those patterns often begin to shift right away. Not months later, not weeks later, almost immediately. Many people make the mistake of waiting for one dramatic clue, one unforgettable moment, or one clear confession. But human behavior rarely works that way. Psychology shows that people reveal themselves through groups of small changes, not one giant signal. It is never just one thing. It is several subtle differences appearing together. That is when listening becomes less important than observing. Watch what he consistently does. Guilt changes behavior. Excitement changes behavior. Secrecy changes behavior. And when all three begin working together, a person can slowly become someone who feels unfamiliar without even noticing it themselves. Have you ever sensed a change before any words were spoken? If so, type "I notice behavior" in the comments. Stay with me, because what comes next helps explain why this matters. Awareness protects you from confusion, and confusion is often the reason people stay trapped in situations they could have understood much sooner. One of the earliest changes people notice is emotional distance. This usually appears when a man is dealing with inner conflict, or when his attention has quietly shifted somewhere else. Emotional distance does not always look harsh or unfriendly. In fact, it is often difficult to recognize at first. He may still send messages, he may still answer your calls, he may still spend time with you, yet something feels different beneath the surface. The warmth is not quite the same. The attention seems divided. The connection feels just a little weaker than before. This happens because emotional presence depends on where the mind is focused. When someone's thoughts become occupied by something new, exciting, or emotionally demanding, they naturally have less emotional energy available for everything else. You may notice conversations becoming more basic. He asks fewer meaningful questions. He stops showing interest in the little details of your day. Long conversations slowly disappear. Instead of speaking because he genuinely enjoys it, it can begin to feel like he is simply responding out of habit. The effort slowly fades, and emotional effort is often the first thing to disappear when attention begins moving elsewhere. But that's only the beginning, because even smaller changes often follow. Another behavior that often appears is delayed communication. His replies may become slower, not necessarily because life suddenly became busier, but because you are no longer occupying the same place in his thoughts. People naturally respond faster to what captures their excitement, and more slowly to what starts feeling like an obligation. As emotional distance grows, conversations can begin to feel like another task instead of something they genuinely look forward to. You may also notice that his emotional reactions become much quieter. Before, he laughed more easily. He teased you. He reacted with excitement. He showed emotion during simple conversations. Now everything feels flatter and more controlled. This can happen because much of his emotional energy is already being invested somewhere else. Physical behavior sometimes changes as well. He may shorten hugs, avoid sitting close, end visits earlier than usual, or struggle to maintain steady eye contact. None of these actions have to be dramatic. They often appear as tiny differences that gradually become impossible to ignore. The important thing is that emotional distance is usually felt before it is clearly seen. Your intuition notices something long before your mind can explain it. It feels like an invisible wall has quietly appeared between you. The emotional door no longer feels completely open. That subtle feeling is why many people ignore the early signs. They cannot prove anything, so they dismiss what they feel. Don't miss this part, because the next behavior is one that many people misunderstand completely. Another important pattern is over-explaining. This is a psychological habit that often appears when someone is trying to manage the story instead of simply sharing the facts. When a man is honest, his explanation is usually clear, natural, and consistent. He tells you where he went, what happened, and moves on. But when someone feels pressure to hide something, the brain often switches into protection mode. Suddenly, the explanation becomes much longer than necessary. He starts adding details that nobody even asked about, trying to answer questions before they are spoken. This happens because guilt and fear create mental pressure. Instead of simply remembering events, his mind is also working to sound believable, avoid mistakes, and keep every part of the story consistent. That extra effort often leads to unnecessary talking. He repeats the same point in different ways. He mentions names, places, traffic schedules, co-workers, and tiny details that have very little connection to the actual question. The purpose is not always clarity. Sometimes the goal is simply to sound convincing. Real experiences are usually remembered in a natural, slightly imperfect way, but carefully managed stories often sound unusually organized, almost rehearsed. What comes next may surprise you because there is another clue hidden inside these conversations. You may even notice that long explanations appear when there was never any suspicion in the first place. A simple question like, "How was your day?" suddenly turns into a complete timeline from morning until night. That does not automatically mean dishonesty, but sometimes it is an attempt to appear completely transparent before anyone becomes curious. Over-explaining is also frequently connected with defensiveness. Ask one small follow-up question, and he may quickly add even more information or seems slightly impatient, almost as though he needs you to believe him immediately. That sense of urgency matters. Someone who is telling the truth usually does not feel pressure to prove every detail. Someone hiding something often wants the conversation to end as quickly as possible, hoping that enough information will stop further questions. Another noticeable shift can involve eye contact and physical closeness. Looking directly into someone's eyes creates emotional openness, and that becomes uncomfortable when a person feels guilty or conflicted. You may notice him looking at his phone more often, glancing around the room, avoiding direct eye contact, or shortening face-to-face conversations. These changes rarely happen all at once. Before, he may have looked directly at you while listening. Now his eyes wander more frequently. Before, he spoke while maintaining steady eye contact. Now he looks away or down much more often. The final insight is the one most people never expect because these small behaviors rarely appear alone. Together, they tell a much bigger story than words ever could. Before, he seemed fully present whenever he looked at you. Now his attention appears scattered, as though his eyes are focused somewhere else. These quiet changes often happen because the mind is trying to reduce emotional pressure. Looking directly into someone's eyes creates a deep emotional connection, and when a person feels guilty, that connection can become uncomfortable instead of comforting. Physical closeness often changes for the same reason. Simple things like sitting close, holding hands, hugging, or sharing personal space naturally build emotional intimacy. If a man feels he is hiding something, those moments can quietly trigger feelings of guilt. Without realizing it, he may begin creating small amounts of distance. He might choose a seat a little farther away, shorten affectionate moments, avoid long hugs, or leave situations where the two of you are alone sooner than before. It is not always obvious or cold. Sometimes it is so subtle that you only notice the feeling has changed. In some situations, the opposite happens. Rather than avoiding affection, he suddenly becomes much more physically affectionate, but something still feels different. The hugs feel rushed. The closeness seems forced. The affection appears more like a duty than a natural expression of emotion. This can happen when someone is trying to ease their own guilt by acting more loving than usual. Stay with me because this next point helps explain why actions often reveal far more than words ever can. The most important thing to remember is that eye contact and physical closeness are guided by emotions, not carefully chosen sentences. A person can usually manage their words much more easily than they can manage their body language. That is why changes in eye contact, physical distance, and affection often reveal emotional truth long before any conversation does. Another noticeable pattern is when someone suddenly becomes either unusually kind or unusually irritated. Both reactions can come from the same emotional pressure. When guilt, confusion, or inner conflict builds up, behavior often moves toward one extreme or the other. Some men become extra thoughtful, extra caring, and unusually attentive. Others become impatient, defensive, or easily frustrated. The difference depends on personality, but the emotional source may be very similar. When someone suddenly becomes much nicer than usual, it is sometimes an unconscious attempt to reduce feelings of guilt. They may compliment you more often, reply to messages more quickly, offer unexpected help, surprise you with small gifts, or behave in a much more romantic way than before. The important detail is not the kindness itself. It is the sudden increase compared to their normal personality. A dramatic shift in behavior often says more than the behavior alone. But that's only part of the picture, because the opposite reaction can be just as revealing. Some people respond to inner guilt with irritation instead of extra kindness. This happens because emotional pressure creates stress, and stress often shows itself through impatience or frustration. Small situations that never caused problems before suddenly become arguments. Ordinary questions feel like accusations even when they are asked calmly. Someone carrying a secret often feels mentally on edge, making emotional reactions quicker and stronger than usual. There is another reason this happens. Creating conflict can also create emotional distance, and emotional distance may temporarily reduce feelings of guilt. Sometimes the disagreement is not really about the issue being discussed. Instead, it becomes a way to build space between two people. With more distance comes less emotional pressure, and with less pressure comes temporary relief. The confusing part is that these behaviors may alternate. One day he seems incredibly caring. The next day he appears distant and easily annoyed. This emotional inconsistency is important because it suggests that something inside him is affecting the way he behaves on the outside. These mood swings rarely happen without a reason. They usually reflect an internal struggle that has not been openly expressed. Don't miss this part, because one of the clearest behavioral changes often involves something people carry with them every day. Changes in phone habits are often among the most noticeable shifts because so much personal communication now happens through a phone. If a man's relationship with his phone suddenly changes, it may suggest that something in his private digital life has also changed. The key word is suddenly. If he has always been protective of his phone, that is simply his normal habit. But if he was once relaxed about it and then becomes unusually careful without an obvious reason, that change naturally stands out. You may notice the phone is always placed face down. Before, it stayed on the table with notifications visible. Now it is quickly turned over whenever a message arrives. This can become an automatic protective habit rather than a planned action. Another common change is taking the phone everywhere. Places where it once stayed behind, like the bathroom, another room, or the kitchen for a few seconds, suddenly become places where the phone always follows. This behavior often shows a desire to keep complete control over access to information. Notifications may also become silent. Message previews disappear from the screen. New passwords, fingerprint locks, or app locks appear where they never existed before. The important point is not privacy itself. Everyone deserves privacy. The important point is the sudden change from previous behavior. What comes next may surprise you because even tiny reactions around a phone can quietly reveal shifting priorities. Another subtle clue appears when you walk near him while he is using his phone. He may instantly lock the screen, switch applications, tilt the phone away, or become slightly tense for a moment. These reactions often happen automatically because protecting information quickly becomes a habit. You might also notice that he spends more time online while taking much longer to reply to your messages. The phone is clearly being used often, yet somehow there is always a delay when it comes to communicating with you. That difference between overall phone activity and response time can reveal where attention is being directed. Another meaningful change involves daily routines. Most people naturally follow stable patterns. They wake up at similar times, eat around the same hours, work predictable schedules, and spend free time in familiar ways. When those routines suddenly shift, especially without a clear explanation, it may suggest that something new is demanding time and attention. The key is not simply that routines change, because life naturally changes. It is when those changes appear suddenly and are supported only by vague explanations. You may notice new periods where he is regularly unavailable. Certain evenings, weekends, or afternoons suddenly become off limits. When you ask what he is doing, the answers remain broad, such as work, helping someone, attending a meeting, or simply being busy. The explanation exists, but the details remain unclear. People usually explain genuine routine changes naturally because there is little reason not to. Another sign is communication timing. Perhaps he once called every evening, but now says he goes to bed much earlier. Maybe he always spoke after work, but now regularly has other commitments. These repeated timing changes often show that priorities inside his daily schedule have quietly shifted. The final insight is the one many people overlook, because routines rarely change without something changing behind the scenes. You may also notice new activities suddenly becoming part of his routine even though they were never mentioned before. A different gym schedule, a new work assignment, a new group of friends, a fresh hobby, a place he now visits regularly. Any one of these changes can be completely normal by itself. People naturally grow and try new things, but when several new routines appear at the same time, it often suggests that his daily life has been reorganized to make room for something new. Another sign is inconsistent availability. Some days he has plenty of free time and seems completely relaxed. On other days, he becomes impossible to reach, and the pattern does not match his usual work or personal responsibilities. This kind of inconsistency can happen when someone is trying to balance two different schedules without letting them overlap. Daily routines are among the most reliable behavioral patterns because people rarely change long-established habits without a meaningful reason. Most routines stay stable until something important requires them to shift. Stay with me, because the next behavior is even easier to overlook, yet it often appears before anything else becomes obvious. Another important change is when he seems mentally distracted, even while sitting right beside you. Being physically present is not the same as being emotionally present. Real attention comes from where the mind is focused. When a man is fully engaged, he listens carefully, responds with interest, and reacts naturally to what you are saying. But when his thoughts are divided, his level of engagement quietly begins to fade. One of the clearest signs is forgetting small details. You tell him something important, but later he asks about it as though the conversation never happened. This does not always mean he stopped caring. Sometimes it means his attention was somewhere else at that moment, so the information never fully settled in his mind. You may also notice that his responses feel delayed or disconnected. You share something meaningful, yet his reply feels generic, slow, or unrelated to the emotion behind your words. It can seem as though he is answering automatically instead of truly listening. This happens because divided attention often creates surface-level conversations instead of genuine emotional connection. But that's only the beginning, because the small signs usually continue building over time. As conversations continue, you may notice his focus drifting more often. His eyes wander around the room. He checks his phone repeatedly. He appears lost in thought while you are speaking. Even if he tries to stay involved, the lack of steady attention slowly becomes noticeable. Over time, it creates the feeling that you are talking without truly being heard. Another subtle sign is reduced curiosity. When someone feels emotionally connected, they naturally ask questions, remember details, and want to learn more about your experiences. When their attention is elsewhere, that curiosity often disappears. Conversations become one-sided because they are no longer actively exploring what you have to say. There is also an emotional difference that is difficult to describe but easy to feel. The conversation continues, yet it lacks warmth and depth. It becomes practical instead of meaningful. Emotional connection depends on focused attention, and attention cannot fully exist in two places at once. Mental distraction is often one of the earliest warning signs because the mind usually shifts long before outward behavior changes completely. Don't miss this part, because another behavior often appears as a direct result of this emotional shift. Another pattern that sometimes develops is creating unnecessary arguments to increase emotional distance. When a man feels conflicted or is hiding something, emotional closeness can begin to feel uncomfortable. The closer two people become, the greater the chance of difficult conversations or uncomfortable questions. Instead of discussing those feelings honestly, he may unconsciously create tension through small disagreements. These arguments are rarely about the actual issue. They simply change the emotional atmosphere. You may notice that small comments, harmless questions, or ordinary expectations suddenly become reasons for conflict. His reaction feels much stronger than the situation seems to deserve. This happens because the real emotion is often connected to something happening inside him rather than the current conversation. The disagreement becomes an outlet for emotional pressure. Afterward, communication often becomes colder or slower, creating even more distance. That distance can temporarily reduce feelings of guilt because less emotional closeness means less emotional pressure. You may also notice increased defensiveness. Neutral questions suddenly sound like criticism to him. Calm conversations quickly become tense. Sometimes old problems that were already resolved are brought back into the discussion, shifting attention away from the present. Over time, these repeated small conflicts create an unstable emotional environment where connection feels uncertain. What comes next may surprise you because another behavioral shift often happens quietly alongside these arguments. Another noticeable change is a sudden increase in the need for privacy and independence. Personal space is healthy, and everyone deserves privacy. The important detail is not privacy itself, but the sudden change in how strongly it is emphasized. When this shift appears without an obvious reason, it can sometimes suggest that there are new conversations, activities, or parts of life that someone prefers to keep separate. You may begin hearing phrases such as, "I need more space," "I don't like being questioned," "I want more independence," or "I shouldn't have to explain everything." On their own, these statements can be completely reasonable. The key is the timing. If they appear suddenly without any major conflict, they may represent an attempt to build new boundaries around areas of life that were previously open. This often happens because ordinary questions begin to feel uncomfortable when someone is trying to protect information. Rather than answering naturally, the focus shifts toward whether the questions themselves are acceptable. You may also notice that certain topics quietly disappear from everyday conversations. Friends, places, plans, or daily experiences are mentioned less often, and the answers become short and general instead of detailed and relaxed. There may also be a stronger emphasis on personal freedom than shared experiences. None of these behaviors automatically mean something is wrong. However, when several of these changes appear together and represent a clear break from previous patterns, they can suggest that someone is intentionally creating more separation between different parts of their life. The final insight is the one many people overlook, because lasting behavioral changes usually reveal far more than carefully chosen words ever will.